So the course tutor is Dr. William Davies. He is a consultant psychologist and head of applied clinical psychology at the Association for Psychological Therapies. Courses written by him have been studied by well over 100,000 mental health professionals, meaning that his input will, at a conservative estimate, have influenced interventions with well over 1 million people. So for more, see Wikipedia, William Davies, psychologist. And without further ado, I will pass you over to Will, who is going to talk to you about acceptance and give you a quick overview of higher order therapy. So all yours, Will.
Great, thanks very much. So yes, the idea of, hello everybody, by the way, hello. The idea of APT's higher order therapy is that it looks at the higher order factors that occur across therapies. Some things keep cropping up no matter what therapy you look at. And also the most effective elements that are in approaches such as CBT, DBT, ACT, solution-focused therapy, compassion-focused therapy, motivational interviewing, RAID, and so on. We're really interested in the things that keep cropping up no matter what therapy you look at. And today's is very much one of them. So the aim is to master all the main effective elements of psychological therapy. So what we've done is broken it down into 30 components. We had component 1 last week, component 2 this week, and on we go. And obviously what we're trying to do is to build them into an integrated approach. Now, today's topic is all about the second arrow, avoiding the second arrow. By acceptance. So that's what we're looking at today. And if you want some more information about that, then you just go to APT Online Training and have a look at it, aptonlinetraining.com, I think. Right. The event is completely free of charge. There's no, whatever it is, there's no fundraising, there's no contributions possibly. It is part of our response to COVID-19. The idea is to try and do something that's helpful, really. So thank you for attending it, and do feel free to invite others to come to future events. We'll see how far we get. It all depends on how much interest there is. There's a lot of interest so far, but we'll see how we go. Not sure how many hot sessions there will be. That's higher order therapy. Yeah, it depends on how long COVID lasts and how much interest there is. But so far, so good. So it's on to today's session, yeah?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a bit technical. So I am going to play the recording. So it's a recorded session. But then with any questions, if you pop them in the chat at any point during the recording, then I'll stop it and then pose your questions to Will. So I am going to try and also have the slides with the recording. So wish us luck. Here we go. So as I say, just pop anything you like in chat at any time.
Welcome to the APT's module on avoiding the second arrow, acceptance, in other words. When you accidentally put your hand on something very hot, there is a reflex to withdraw it, which is just as well. But there's more than that. There is distress and concern about possible damage you may have done to yourself, and checking to see if you need to do some running repairs and so on, which is all good. Likewise, if you fall over and cut and graze yourself, there's damage, and there's also concern about the damage, which also works well. But when you transfer this to the mental world, it doesn't work so well. It means that when we get depressed, we can get down about being depressed, which makes us more depressed, which makes us more down about it, and so on. So we very quickly get into a downward spiral. The same with anxiety. When we get anxious, we can get agitated and uptight about being anxious, which makes the anxiety worse. So we get more agitated and uptight about it, which makes the anxiety worse still, and so on, into the spiral again. And both of these, and all the parallels in other forms of mental distress, are really serious. They can turn an already undesirable state into something very much worse because of this spiraling effect. It is almost like a nuclear reaction. Once it starts, it feeds on itself and is almost impossible to stop. Of course, no one wants to be depressed or anxious or angry or in a psychotic episode in the first place. But the distress about it can greatly amplify the actual experience of it and spiral it into something much more depressing or anxiety-provoking or whatever it is than it ever needs to be. Well, I say that, you say, but what can we do about it? I said it was a natural effect or reflex with something physical like touching something hot. So maybe it's just as natural as something mental like depression, anxiety, and so on. And yes, it is, I think, but that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about it, as those who love mindfulness have discovered. The concept of acceptance features strongly in mindfulness and is a good one. Acceptance is in some ways the opposite of should thinking. Albert Ellis long ago introduced us to the idea that should is an unhelpful word. So, for example, the following statements don't work well for people. I should feel more energetic. I should be happier. I shouldn't feel tense all the time. I should be more outgoing, and so on. These are not very easy statements to act on. You can tell yourself that you shouldn't feel tense all the time, but what are you meant to do about it? Whereas acceptance is easier to act on. For example, those same statements translate into something that we can much more easily do. Just accept that you don't feel energetic at the moment. Just accept that you are not particularly happy at the moment. Just accept that you are tense at the moment. Just accept that you like your own company. So acceptance is key. It stops us getting agitated that we're anxious and worry about being agitated that we are anxious and so on. But how do we help people to accept a state of affairs they'd prefer not to have to accept? I think mindfulness addresses this head-on in a clear but sophisticated way. It does other things as well, but this is the key thing perhaps. The first thing it does is to teach you mindful meditation. At its simplest, this will invite you to focus on, for example, your breathing. And it invites you to accept your breathing just as it is, not to try to smooth it out, or to breathe more deeply or more shallowly, or to count while you breathe, or anything else. Just to observe your breathing and accept it just the way it is. Jagged, variable, whatever. And this is a terrific start. If you can accept your breathing the way it is, then you can accept most other things the way they are. After all, breathing is as fundamental as it gets. So that's a terrific start. If you can teach people how to do that, then you are doing them a great favor. That's because you've taught them the principle. If they can observe and accept their breathing, then maybe they can observe and accept their mood. It's a small step. But don't try and do both steps together. Do breathing first. It's easy to teach people to observe their breathing and to accept it as it is. You simply talk them through doing just that in a straightforward way. You can get mindfulness meditation apps to do it for you if you want, but your patients will probably appreciate you talking them through it for 10 minutes or so, helping them observe and accept their own breathing. Moreover, you can do it in a straightforward tone of voice, whereas most of the meditation apps are spoken in a slightly weird tone, which I think the speaker thinks makes it sound Eastern, and therefore extra good. But there's no need for you to sound Eastern, unless you want to, of course, or unless you are actually Eastern. Observing and accepting things are two good, straightforward skills, accessible to anyone, anywhere. And then you will want to teach your patients to observe and accept their mood. And I have to say, this is a bit more difficult than teaching breathing meditations. Mainly perhaps because at first sight it seems a bit defeatist to accept that you are depressed or anxious or whatever. As a therapist, you wonder whether your patient will confront you with, well, a fine sort of therapist you are. I come to you asking for help, telling you how desperately depressed I am, and all you say is that I should accept it. And of course, they could well feel exactly like that if you don't explain the rationale behind acceptance, as we did at the beginning of this talk. The metaphor of deflecting the second arrow and of the spiraling are good ones, I think. For example, it's bad enough being hit with the first arrow of anxiety, say, but it's much worse when you're hit with the second arrow of getting agitated and worried about being anxious, because that makes the anxiety worse, which causes more agitation, and so more anxiety, and so on. So the patient needs to be thoroughly persuaded by that rationale, and an exactly similar one for if they're depressed, or if they're irritable, or angry, or whatever it is. The second idea that makes it more acceptable is that accepting things doesn't prohibit you from doing something about them. It's like finding yourself in the safety net underneath your trapeze. There's no rule against you getting back on your trapeze again. The safety net simply stops you hurting when you make an error. So coming out of the metaphor, accepting your anxiety, say, stops you getting into a spiral about it and puts you in a place where you can decide whether to do something about it or to simply accept it and let it wear off in its own time. The third idea comes straight out of mindfulness practice, and that is to get good at it yourself before trying to teach it to someone else. It being observing and accepting your mood or changes in mood. So, let's assume now you've bought into the rationale, you've got good at observing and accepting your own changes in mood, and are getting good at teaching your patients to do the same. What sort of patients should you be using this with? And I suggest these. With people when they are depressed, simply accepting it is better than also being down about being depressed. And it frees them to do something about it, or not, as they choose. With anxiety of all sorts, being anxious is bad enough without getting uptight about being anxious, and it doesn't stop them learning coping strategies as well, if they want to.
Just going to pause there for a second because we've got some hands up, which is exciting. Unfortunately, we can't do the hands up because if we unmuted people, there are, as I say, hundreds, so it might be a little bit chaotic. But if anyone wants to write their question in chat, that would be lovely. And then I can pop your questions to Will. So sorry about the hands, but the chat box is fabulous. You okay with everything, Will?
Yeah, very good, yeah.
Lovely, okay.
With irritability, one of my patients said that his bouts of irritability were absolutely infuriating. I think he saw the irony of that, and he did very, very well. And I'll tell you about him shortly. I'll tell you more about him. With episodes of psychosis, the fact of having 2 or more bouts of psychosis is very distressing, which only causes more stress and increases the likelihood of further bouts. So we want to cut through that spiral. With physical problems such as pain. Pain is bad enough, but to be frustrated and angered by it means that you now have 2 problems, not 1. Frankly, it's difficult to see where it's not a good idea to accept things and then review to see if you want to do anything about it. There's a good metaphor for this. Having your hands bound together only hurts if you try to struggle free. It's a slightly odd metaphor, I think, but it's a good one because struggling free is a great thing to do if you can do it. But if you can't, then it only serves to hurt and frustrate you. Better to settle down, appraise your situation, and decide whether struggling is going to pay off, or is it just going to hurt. But as a metaphor, I rarely use with patients. It usually doesn't feel right to do so, but I think you can handle it okay. Now, I said I'd tell you more about my irritable patient who said that his bouts of irritability infuriated him, thereby putting his finger on exactly the problem with not accepting things and spiraling instead. The more irritated he got, the more infuriated he got. And so the more irritated he became, and so on. It's the nuclear reaction. He's actually a great patient because he was one of those rare ones who went from having long-term, seriously life-limiting problems to being effectively 100% cured, which you and I know is very rare. Good improvements, yes. Great improvements, yes. Transformations, very rarely, but he was one, and I think his success was down almost entirely to him developing the skill of observation and acceptance. He thoroughly took to acceptance and was very eloquent at it too, describing how it was a matter not just of accepting that he has bouts of irritability or had bouts of irritability, but accepting that other people could be genuinely irritating.
Just got a question from Steph. What if a person can't accept even their own breathing or other body sensations in mindfulness? Oh, I think you just unmute. Sorry, Will.
Yeah, there we are. I think that would be very unusual, to be fair, because when you're sort of focusing on your breathing, all that's asked of you is that you notice what it's doing, because breathing tends not to be smooth when people breathe. It can be jagged, it can be long breaths, short breaths. It varies over a period of 10 minutes or whatever. And all you're asking the patient to do is accept that, because it's happening anyway, and just to accept that. So that's not a lot to ask. And as a general rule, people do accept that. They don't necessarily like it. They don't say, oh, I really enjoy doing this. Some do, but as a general rule, they do accept that happens, and it's does them no harm, as it were.
And then it's particularly difficult if they've got anxiety and it feels like they're having a heart attack. So any suggestions for that?
Well, the same thing really, that breathing, I know what you mean. It's when you're very anxious like that, it does feel like you're having a heart attack. And people tend to hyperventilate. And of course, when you hyperventilate, the natural process in the brain tries to stop you breathing. And then that makes people more anxious because they now can't breathe. So it is very anxiety provoking. On the other hand, it is also the solution. If you can really teach people mindful breathing, mindful meditation, that is the kind of solution to that very phenomenon. Because the brain will automatically help you to breathe in the correct way. You focus on it and you just accept it, try not to influence it, just observe it. It will automatically regulate the breathing and stop that phenomenon happening. You're quite right, though. Some people have a lot of trouble with it. It is very, very difficult for them to do that. But most people don't.
Brilliant. And can you think of any other metaphors that it might be likened to?
Oh, other than the bound hands?
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head. It kind of makes sense to people, though, that the more you struggle, the more it hurts, kind of thing. It's sort of, but you're quite right. I don't like using the bound wrists metaphor. It would be good to have an alternative. I bet somebody is going to come up with a really good alternative.
There's a challenge for chat there, everybody.
Okay. We'll find a good one.
Oh, there's one already. From Simon, we've got a quicksand.
Oh, brilliant. The more you struggle, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, so there's still a challenge in the chat box for everybody there, and I'll continue with the audio.
Yeah. And there's no need to get uptight that they are irritating. You can just accept it. So he fought the battle of acceptance on two fronts and won on both. Just in case you've noticed that I said his transformation was down almost entirely to acceptance, I think the other component, just in case you're interested, was him improving biological factors, notably his sleeping and his circadian rhythm, which I think went hand in hand. So, observation and, in particular, acceptance are key ideas, and it feature widely. Most notably, of course, in mindfulness, and I have a notion that they are the most important active ingredient in mindfulness. They feature overtly in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, where acceptance is acceptance in just the same way we've been talking about. And commitment is the idea of committing yourself to acting in accordance with your principles, which the therapist helps you identify. And acceptance also features in DBT in the fact that mindfulness forms a key part of DBT. So it's interesting that mindfulness, DBT, and ACT, three of the most effective interventions we have, all have observation and acceptance as a key part of them. And observation and acceptance are such simple things, which makes sense to me because I always think that living a rewarding life and helping others to lead a rewarding life cannot be a complex process. Incidentally, in ACT, they often talk about a curious scientist, as for example in observe your changes in mood like a curious scientist would, noting the exact changes that take place. It's a good image, I think, and certainly helps some people with the observation bit of observation and acceptance. Okay, so in terms of related modules and concepts, the recovery philosophy mines a very similar vein. The recovery philosophy was developed by service users and their families, mainly people with long-term serious mental illnesses like recurring psychotic episodes. Their thinking was to accept that they weren't going to get cured in the traditional sense, but they could nevertheless work on recovering a good quality of life. A terrific idea, I think, and it takes the acceptance idea to its fully developed conclusion, accepting that you're not going to get cured in the traditional sense, but you can recover a good quality of life. Validation is also a related module, though in a slightly more knight's move kind of way, in the sense that acceptance is taken a stage further, where you not only accept that the patient does what they do, for example, to cut themselves, but you work out why they do it, often to get relief from tension or stress in this case. The key difference from what we've been talking about is that acceptance and understanding is a stepping stone to doing something about the problem, in this case finding a better way for the person to get relief from tension or stress. So, there we are. The concept of acceptance is a wonderful one because it deflects the second arrow. It stops us becoming agitated about being anxious, or put down by being depressed, infuriated about being irritable, and so on. It's a simple, effective idea that features right at the front of some of our most effective therapies, and it is straightforward for us to learn and teach to our patients, usually starting with observing and accepting our breathing, and then taking it from there. So, in your resources, I'm going to put in some good things, namely...
Okay, so I'll stop it there. That was a quick one today with not many questions. Sorry, Will, are you going to say something?
Well, no, I was just struck with what people said about the metaphors, that like the quicksand metaphor is a very good one, I think. But of course, just like the bound wrists one, it is not very nice. The more you struggle, the more you go into quicksand. But of course, that's the whole point in a way. The metaphors are very good. They very accurately describe what we're talking about with not doing the mindfulness. Yeah, the more depressed you get, the more frustrated you get that you're depressed. And the more frustrated you get, the more depressed you get. And you go around in a circle very quickly. So that indeed is a very nasty situation to get into. So the metaphors that represent it, they're nasty too. But the way out, of course, is to stop struggling, you know.
And sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but Solin has put a quote from Russ Harris that quicksand, the worst thing you can do is to struggle. The way to survive is to lay back and float to the surface. Because every instinct in your body tells you to struggle. But if you do what comes naturally and instinctively, you'll drown. Oh gosh. And notice, lying back and floating is psychologically tricky. It doesn't come naturally, but it is a lot less physical effort than struggling.
Yep, that's exactly right. And of course, that's in ACT, that's taken from ACT. And yeah, it's a good component of ACT.
People are trying to find more ones. Fiona says, in a more positive, can you frame it in a more positive way? The less you wriggle about in the water, the better you float.
Yes, the more you accept it, the less distressed you are. Yeah.
And is it Russ Harris that says is it the clipboard metaphor that you could hold it out in front of your face? And so that might be another one. And Rosalind has asked, does acceptance help with guilt?
Yes, well, it does. If you can do it, that's probably one of the more difficult ones to do, isn't it? But absolutely it does, because with shame and guilt, it's a lack of acceptance of what you've done. One is kind of internal, and the other one is embarrassment in front of other people. But either way, if you can accept what you've done and accept that you're a fallible human being, then for sure it helps with shame or guilt. Yeah.
And how would this relate to distraction? What do you think of distracting mechanisms towards a thought? Would that be the opposite of acceptance?
No, it's related, all right, because let's suppose you've got a patient who is distressed in whatever way. Let's say they're depressed for the sake of argument. Now, you might help them to accept when they get bouts of depression, simply to accept it, don't struggle against it. So at least you haven't got the second arrow going into you. So they accept being depressed. But they might say to you, well, that's all very well, but I don't really want to accept it. I'll accept it if you say so, but I also want to do something about it while I'm accepting it. And then you might teach them distraction. Okay, well, what could you do? Could you immerse yourself in phoning up a friend, watching the television, playing computer games, whatever it would be, some distraction task, rather than simply accepting it. But the two can go hand in hand very nicely like that, yeah.
And I'm not sure if Peter's just giving us a gardening tip, but Peter says, if you want orange juice, don't plant apple seeds.
Well, that sounds...
It's hard to know what to say, isn't it? Sorry. There we go. Top tip. Thank you, Peter. And David Pike says, it is more problematic if the person believes if they do not struggle, they will die. You would have to be mad to accept reality, surely.
Well, this is it, isn't it? And that's why you can't go straight into, just accept whatever's happening to you. You have to start on something fairly easy, like accept just what you're breathing for 10 minutes, see what happens. And the wonderful thing is that, of course, the cerebellum actually is responsible for your breathing. It does it perfectly for you. And if you just leave it to it, it does it better than you ever can by thinking about it. So that works very well. And so it's just, once you've made that first step, then you can move on to something else. But of course, people want to, their natural thing is to struggle against it. Yeah.
Well, now Kim's come up with a lovely metaphor. Here we go. How about a metaphor of driving around the world in a four-wheel drive and demanding we experience no bumps, no cold, or no heat? If we can acknowledge that it's normal, the more we will help ourselves to navigate the terrain and understand the journey, versus bracing and fearing the terrain and what's coming up. What do you think?
I think that's really good.
That's good,
and
isn't
it actually makes sense. The more you think about it, the more, if you kind of tense yourself up, every time you hit a bump, you're going to do yourself a damage, aren't you? Whereas if you're nice and relaxed in your lovely four-wheel drive, especially if it's a Range Rover, perhaps, if you get nice and relaxed in your four-wheel drive, then you're going to do yourself less damage. So nice metaphor, yeah.
Well done, Kim. And here we go, another good one to test you. How does it work with dissociative disorders, where one is often dealing with passive responses to trauma?
Oh, well, one of the great things about what we do, the latest therapies we do in the last, whatever it is, last half of the last century, is it's evidence-based. So you can try it out with whoever you're thinking of, you can try it and see if they find it helpful. But to be absolutely honest, if you're working with someone with dissociative disorder, I would be prepared to untry it pretty quickly. I'd be monitoring what we did and be prepared to backtrack pretty quickly.
Haley's come up with a good one. I think with patients that do not want to engage in acceptance, you'd say if you always do what you've always done, you'll be fighting the same struggle.
Yes. It is remarkable how strong patients can be about about maintaining the unhelpful thing they already do. And it can be very sort of convincing that the unhelpful things they do are kind of the only way of performing, you know? And I think we have to be, you can't be confrontational ever, I don't think, with a patient, but we do have to be confident that what we're talking about does make sense. And if we could convince them, genuinely convince them, then it would be very helpful for them.
And Natalie suggested a book called Who Moved My Cheese, which is about dealing with change and overlaps with acceptance.
Yeah.
It's like having an accident and hurting your back. If you don't keep still, you may kill yourself. Gosh, the metaphors are a little on the harsh side, aren't they?
Well, yes, but that's why they're good metaphors, I think, because the very psychological phenomenon we're talking about is very harsh. When people who get really depressed, they get frustrated that they're depressed, that makes it twice as bad, and the whole thing goes around in a spiral so quickly.
There is a lot of love for Who Moved My Cheese, and that was somebody asked for the name of the book, and I think it's Who Moved My Cheese. Okay, so that is the end of the question. So we're finished super early today.
Yeah, it's okay. I don't think anyone ever minds finishing early.
But note before we go, I am going to put the meerkats on. So just to remind everybody, the event is completely free of charge, part of our COVID-19 response. So thank you ever so much for attending. It's so lovely to see the names pop back up week after week. Really nice. And we are going to, as Will said, carry on as long as we are going to carry on, really, aren't we?
Yeah. We'll keep coming. We'll
on
be
that bombshell.
It's just you and me.
Okay, so lovely to see you all, and we will hang around for questions on the chat. Otherwise, see you next week. Well, do you know what we're going to do next week, or is it a surprise?
It's another of the hot higher order therapy modules. I can't remember which one. It's the next one, the next one on the list. Oh, I'll tell you where it will be. It'll be on the website. They're all listed there, aren't they?
Yeah, they're all on the website. You go to apt.ac and then search for free webinars, and you'll find them all there. Okay.
Lovely. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I'll put the nice relaxing music on if you want to ask any questions and everything else. See you next week, I hope.